From now on, I think it'll be easier if your paycheck just goes directly into my account, my son said, stirring his coffee as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. And it was a gray Thursday afternoon in late October, the kind of Wisconsin day when the sky looked like brushed steel and the air carried that faint, smoky scent of burning leaves. And I sat across from him in my kitchen with my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold long ago, listening as Daniel spoke without the slightest tremor in his voice. Not nervous at all, confident in fact, too confident for a man asking his mother to hand over her entire financial life, delivering the suggestion with the same polished, professional calm he had perfected since becoming a financial consultant in Milwaukee, as if what he was proposing were nothing more than standard procedure. It's just practical, he continued smoothly, explaining how complicated online banking can be these days, and how he could handle everything from me, taxes, transfers, so I wouldn't have to worry about a thing. And he smiled while he said it, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and for a few seconds I couldn't speak at all. I just watched him, searching his face for some trace of the boy I had raised alone, after his father died in that factory accident 30 years ago, wanting desperately to find warmth there, but seeing instead a certain distance, a faint impatience, like a man trying to close a business deal with a difficult client. And finally, I asked softly, "And you'd have access to all my accounts?" And he answered, "Of course," as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, adding that it would make things smoother for both of us, and that I could trust him, Mom. And I took a slow breath as the word trust settled heavily in the air between us, because once upon a time I would have signed anything he placed in front of me without a second thought. But now, there was something in his tone too rehearsed, too formal, that sent a cold ripple through me, and I forced a small smile and said quietly, "I see. That sounds reasonable." And his expression brightened immediately. He leaned forward and pressed one of those quick, mechanical kisses to my forehead, the kind he had learned from his wife, Kayla. Gestures that looked affectionate but felt like performance. And as he rose from the chair he said, "You'll see, Mom, it's for your own good." And that phrase, "for your own good," hung in the air, long after he left, echoing through the empty kitchen like the ticking of the wall clock, while outside the wind picked up and rattled the dry corn stalks in the field beyond my window. And I stared at the half-empty mug before me and realized I hadn't actually agreed to anything at all. I had simply gone quiet, and I reminded myself that silence can sometimes be more powerful than words. And that night I lay awake listening to the creaking of the old farmhouse, thinking about how easily Daniel had spoken, how confident he had been, how little hesitation he had shown in asking for control over my life. And something in me shifted then, something old and instinctive, the part of me that had once survived widow, debt, and exhaustion stirring awake again. Because if Daniel wanted control, he would soon learn that I had my own plans and that I was far from done. And Friday came cold and wind-bitten, the kind of evening when the trees around my farmhouse leaned under the weight of November, and I spent the entire day quietly moving things around, packing, cleaning, rearranging, until by the time the sun slipped behind the barn, half the house looked bare. The living room stripped of its sofa and TV, and even its curtains, leaving only my old rocking chair and the scent of lemon oil on the wooden floor. And I wasn't losing my mind. I was running a test, because for the past 3 years Daniel and his wife Kayla had shown up every single Friday evening without fail, never calling ahead, never asking if I had plans, simply arriving around 6 expecting dinner to be ready, their table set, their wine glasses clean, their comfort guaranteed. And it had begun as something sweet. "We just want to keep you company," Kayla would say, as she handed me her empty plate after dinner. But the truth was simpler. They came to eat, not to visit. And that night when I heard Daniel's car crunch over the gravel driveway, I wiped my hands on a towel and sat down in the chair, my heart beating so loudly it seemed to echo through the empty room. "And Mom," Daniel called as the front door opened, his voice cheerful and full of that false warmth he reserved for other people's mothers. "We're here." And then there was a pause, a stretch of silence, and a moment later, Kayla's voice sliced through the house, high and sharp and full of shock. "Daniel, what on earth happened in here?" And their footsteps thundered down the hall as Daniel appeared first with his eyes wide, scanning the stripped room like a man surveying the scene of a crime. Kayla close behind him, clutching her purse, as though thieves might still be hiding in the shadows. "And Mom," Daniel said, his tone shifting instantly from confusion to alarm, "where's everything? The couch, the TV, the dining table, And I looked up at him calmly and said softly, I sold some things. I thought I should have a little cash on hand before transferring my money into your account. And for a second there was only silence before Daniel's face wrined and his jaw tightened as he demanded, You, what? While Kayla's eyes narrowed and she snapped, You sold your furniture. Why would you do that? And I smiled faintly, because I wanted to see what mattered more to you. The things in this house or me? I asked, and Daniel's nostrils flared almost instantly as he shot back. You're being ridiculous. How are we supposed to watch TV when we come over now? How are we supposed to be comfortable? And the words landed like knives, sharp and deliberate, because he said we comfortable, and not once did he say you. And I felt something inside me registered that difference with painful clarity as I rose slowly from my chair, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet, and said quietly, Daniel, if you were worried about my comfort, you wouldn't be standing here shouting about furniture. But he took a step closer, his eyes blazing, and snapped, You're acting crazy. Maybe you really do need someone to handle things for you. While Kayla crossed her arms and added with cool accusation, We only come here to make sure you're okay, and this is how you repay us, selling everything. It's selfish. Selfish. And that word echoed in my mind because it was the same word his father had used years ago when I refused to lend him my savings. And in that moment something cold and clean settled inside me, steady and unshakable, and I said, Dinner's not ready, and it won't be. If you're hungry, you can find somewhere else to eat. And for a heartbeat the only sound was the wind outside pushing against the windows as Daniel stared at me as though I had become a stranger to him. And then, with a voice stripped of emotion, he said, Be careful, Mom. A woman alone, without family. It's easy for things to go wrong. And that warning lingered long after they slammed the door and their car disappeared down the gravel road, leaving me standing in the empty house where the silence hummed with something fierce and final. Not fear and not grief, but the beginning of clarity. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of Daniel's plan. It was only the start of mine. And that night I couldn't sleep, as the wind howled through the old maple trees and brushed against the windows like restless hands while I lay there, listening to every sound of the house I had built with decades of labor and quiet sacrifice, thinking how strange it is that a single evening can make you revisit an entire lifetime. And when Daniel called me crazy, it echoed like a voice from the past, dragging me back to where everything began, to when I was 29, and Tom, my husband, died in that mill accident in February 1st, 1992. When the snow outside the hospital window looked almost blue beneath the fluorescent lights and they handed me his wedding ring in a paper envelope and Daniel was only 3. And I remember going home that night holding him in my arms and promising myself that no matter what I would give him a good life. And for years that promise became the axis around which my world turned as I worked days at the local library in Baraboo and cleaned offices at the courthouse at night, coming home after midnight with my hands raw from bleach and often too tired to eat. But Daniel never went without, because when he was 10 and wanted new sneakers, Nike, blue, and silver, even though they cost nearly as much as a week's groceries, I bought them anyway, and he wore them to school the next day beaming, and that smile made every aching muscle worth it. And later, when he wanted to join the summer robotics camp, I sold my mother's old jewelry to pay the fee, and he never knew that. And at 18, when Daniel got accepted to a private business college in Chicago, I didn't have the tuition money but refused to let him settle for less, so I mortgaged the house, the very same farmhouse we lived in now, to cover his education, and told him it was an investment in his future and he promised he'd pay it back someday. And he graduated at 23, standing tall in his navy gown and shaking hands with the dean while I cried through the ceremony, not only because I was proud, though I was, but because I was so relieved I could finally stop fighting so hard, thinking the hardest years were behind us. But when he came home, something had changed, and he moved back in for a little while. He said, to save money before finding his own place, and that little while turned into 5 years where I paid the bills and cooked, and even let him use my car because his wasn't reliable while he worked for a financial firm downtown, and saved every penny. And when he finally moved out, he bought a modern condo in Milwaukee, paid in cash, and I remember helping him pack, folding his shirts while he checked his emails, and he hugged me quickly and said, Don't worry, Mom, you'll always be taken care of. And at the time I thought he meant he'd look after me, but now I realize he meant he'd take control of me. And as I lay in bed that night listening to the whisper of the wind against the windows, a thought surfaced that chilled me more than the cold Wisconsin air. Maybe my son had been preparing for this moment, not for weeks or months, but for years. And the following Monday the air carried the bite of approaching winter, with frost clinging to the edges of my windows, and every breath inside the farmhouse feeling heavier and sharper as I made myself a cup of tea that tasted like dust, and couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's face that night, the anger and the threat behind his smile. And I knew I needed the truth, so I took the early bus to town and walked straight into Summit Community Bank, the small local branch I had used for nearly 30 years, where the teller, a young woman named Lindsay, recognized me. "Good morning, Mrs. Morris," she said kindly, her voice gentle in a way that almost made it harder to speak. And when she asked, "How can I help you today?" I forced myself to answer, "I'd like to review my account history," my voice trembling even as I tried to keep it steady, adding, "For the last 6 months, please, every transaction." And Lindsay nodded without hesitation, printing the pages and handing them to me while I moved to the waiting area and sat down to read, my hands already cold before I saw anything at all, though it didn't take long, because halfway down the first page my eyes caught on a withdrawal $1,200 taken out 3 months earlier, the location listed as Milwaukee, and I hadn't been to Milwaukee in years, and I felt my throat close as if something invisible had wrapped around it. So I leaned forward and whispered, "Excuse me, can you tell me more about this withdrawal?" And Lindsay leaned closer too, lowering her voice as she explained, "It was made with your debit card in person at our Milwaukee branch. Do you still have that card?" And I opened my purse immediately and pulled it out, telling her it had been with me the whole time. And she frowned slightly and said that was unusual because the system showed my PIN had been entered correctly. And in that instant memory struck me so sharply it almost made me dizzy, because 3 months ago Daniel had shown up unexpectedly while I was in the shower, and I had shouted for him to come in, and he had waited in the living room, where my purse and my card had been sitting right there. And I thanked Lindsay quietly, folded the papers with hands that no longer felt steady, and walked out into the cold, where my knees felt weak and the world itself seemed tilted as if the ground beneath me had shifted. And when I reached home, I sat at my kitchen table, spreading out every old bank statement I could find, looking through them one by one and marking every transaction I didn't recognize until the table was littered with yellow notes and highlighter marks, and there were more $600, $900, even a credit card payment to a company I didn't remember signing up for. And when I saw the statement listing Home Pro Design Center, Milwaukee, something inside me went quiet, because Daniel had renovated his condo last year and I had complimented him on how beautiful it looked, the granite counters, the oak cabinets, and he had smiled and said, "It's all hard work, Mom." But the numbers on the page told a different story entirely, and I pressed my hands to my face, feeling the betrayal burn deep, not just because of the money, but because of how casually he had done it. And when I finally lifted my head, the daylight outside had faded to gray, and the clock ticked loudly into the silence, until headlights suddenly swept across my window, slow and deliberate, and I saw Daniel's black SUV sitting there without a knock, without a word, just parked for a minute before driving away. And I understood then that it wasn't a visit, but a warning, and that my son wasn't just greedy, he was watching me. And I stayed awake the entire night with every sound amplified in the quiet house, until by morning I had made my decision that if Daniel wanted a war over my life, then I would fight it my way, quietly, carefully, completely. And the next morning the first snow of the season fell across the Wisconsin hills, dusting the fields like powdered sugar, soft and deceptive, just like Daniel's charm. And I watched it from my kitchen window, holding a folder of papers so tightly my knuckles turned white, knowing inside it were the bank printouts, the suspicious transactions, and the receipts I had dug up the night before, each page feeling like a wound I refused to bleed quietly from. And by 10 a.m. I was standing in a small office on Jefferson Street in downtown Madison, where the glass door read a law, and the man inside wasn't what I expected. No slick suit or expensive pen, just a calm man in his 50s with warm eyes and a patient voice, carrying the kind of stillness you only find in people who have seen too much. And he listened without interrupting as I told him everything from Daniel's proposal about handling my money to the Friday night outburst to the mysterious withdrawals. And when I finished, he sat back with his fingers steepled under his chin and said gently, "Mrs. Maurice, What you're describing isn't confusion or family disagreement. It's financial fraud, and it's considered a form of elder abuse under Wisconsin law. And those words, abuse, hit me harder than I expected because I had spent a lifetime avoiding them, believing they belonged to strangers on the news and not to my own son. And he continued firmly, do not sign anything your son gives you. Not a form, not a note, nothing. We'll start by securing your finances. I'll help you open a new account, one he doesn't know exists. Then we'll document every single incident. And I nodded, fighting the sting behind my eyes as I admitted softly that I didn't want to ruin his life. I just wanted mine back. And Mr. Lee smiled sadly and said that sometimes protecting yourself isn't about revenge but about survival. And that afternoon we opened a new savings account under legal confidentiality, and I changed every password, every PIN, every email, feeling as though I was building a fortress brick by brick that had been missing my entire life. And that evening, as I brewed tea, my phone rang, and Daniel's name flashed across the screen. And for a moment I considered ignoring it before answering and hearing him say, "Mom," in a voice unusually flat, telling me I had gone to the bank that day. And my heart stopped as I asked how he knew, and he laughed a low, joyless sound reminding me that he worked with numbers and got alerts when linked accounts moved. And when I whispered, "Linked accounts, you shouldn't have any linked accounts with me," he paused before saying almost playfully that I should really trust him because I wasn't as careful as I thought. And when the call ended, I stood frozen with the phone still pressed to my ear, knowing he was watching. Though what he didn't know was that I had already changed everything: the account, the passwords, even the locks on my doors. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the snow swirling outside the window, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost electric that I wasn't the woman he thought he could manipulate anymore. I wasn't just someone's mother. I was a woman who had survived poverty, widowhood, and decades of quiet battles, and I was about to fight back with patience, precision, and a truth he could never twist. 3 days later, the storm came, and the sky above Baraboo turned the color of bruised steel, while thunder rolled across the valley like a warning. And I had just finished locking the back door when I saw Daniel's black SUV pull into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the curtain of rain, Kayla in the passenger seat with her hair perfect, even in the storm. And they didn't call first. They never did. The doorbell rang 3 times sharp, demanding, and I took a breath, straightened my cardigan, and opened the door only halfway. "Mom, what's going on?" Daniel's tone wasn't concern. It was command, rain streaking down his coat as he stared at me. "Why are you doing this? Why did you move your accounts? Why are you talking to lawyers?" And so, he knew, of course, he did. And I met his gaze and said, "You've been taking money from me for years, Daniel, and I have proof." And his eyes flickered just for a second before his face hardened as he shot back, "That's ridiculous. You're confused." While Kayla stepped forward, her voice dripping with condescension, "Helen, you're under a lot of stress. Daniel told me you've been acting paranoid. He's only trying to help." But I didn't move. And I said, "Help? Is that what you call opening credit cards in my name, taking out loans, using my money for your renovations?" And Daniel's jaw tightened as he insisted, "You don't know what you're talking about." And I held up the folder, the papers inside neatly organized, every withdrawal, every unauthorized purchase, every false signature. And I told him, "I know exactly what I'm talking about." And lightning flashed behind him, lighting up his face like a photograph. And for the first time I saw something raw, their fear. And he said, "You can't prove it was me." But his voice wavered, and I replied, "I don't have to. The bank already did." And Kayla scoffed, though her hand gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles widened as she said, "You wouldn't dare report your own son." And I answered, "I already have." The words steady, cold, final, and Daniel took a step closer, towering over me. "You think you can ruin my life after everything I've done for you?" And I shot back, "Done for me," my voice rising for the first time, cutting through the storm. "You stole from me, lied to me, used me like an ATM you could control. I gave you everything, Daniel, my youth, my health, my home, but I will not give you my dignity." And for a long moment the only sound was the rain hammering the porch roof before Daniel laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "He'll regret this. You're old, alone, and no one's going to believe your story." And I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "They will when they see the evidence and when they hear the recordings." And he froze. "What recordings?" And I smiled faintly. "You should have been more careful when you called me last week." And Kayla's expression cracked. For the first time, she looked afraid, and I said, "Get out," opening the door wider, before I called the sheriff, and they left, slamming the screen door so hard it rattled, the sound of their car disappearing into the storm, and leaving me in silence. And I stood there drenched in rain and relief, my hands trembling not from fear but from power, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the woman begging to be heard, I was the one holding the truth. And the storm outside suddenly felt like an ally. The next few weeks unfolded like the slow thaw after a blizzard, quiet, unsettling, but full of change. The storm that had rattled my windows that night had passed, but another kind was brewing, one that would tear through Daniel's carefully built image of success. And Attorney Lee filed the official fraud report within days, the banks confirming what we already knew. Over $15,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, 2 fraudulent credit cards, and a personal loan opened with my forged signature. And I signed every document without hesitation, each penstroke feeling like reclaiming a piece of myself. Then came the silence. Daniel didn't call, didn't show up, didn't try to apologize, but I wasn't naive enough to think he'd given up. And I didn't have to wait long because, one morning while I was sweeping snow off the porch, my neighbor, old Mrs. Caldwell, shuffled across the road holding her phone. "Helen, honey," she said, her voice trembling, "you should see what your boys posted online." And I took the phone, and there it was, a long Facebook post with Daniel's name above it, the photo of him and Kayla smiling in their polished living room, captioned, "Sometimes family turns against you when all you tried to do was help them protect your peace, even if it means walking away." And the comments were full of sympathy. "You're such a good son. Stay strong, Daniel. Toxic parents can be the worst." And I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. The betrayal not even surprising me anymore, only confirming what I already knew, that my son wasn't just trying to steal my money, he wanted to steal my story. And that afternoon Attorney Lee called. "Helen," he said calmly, "Daniel's lawyer has reached out. They want to discuss a settlement." And it turned out Daniel's company had found out about the investigation, and as a financial consultant, fraud under his name, family or not, was career suicide, his reputation cracking faster than ice on the lake in spring. And when we met in Lee's office, Daniel looked nothing like the polished man I once knew, his suit hanging loose on him, his face pale and sleepless. "Kayla not coming," and he said quietly, "Mom, let's fix this privately. We don't need courts or police. I'll repay you." And I didn't answer. I looked at him the way I used to look at overdue bills, something that needed handling, not pity. And Lee slid the agreement across the desk. Daniel would repay every cent plus damages and legal fees. But that wasn't the part that made him flinch. The last clause was mine. He would post a public statement acknowledging that he had committed financial misconduct against me. No excuses, no lies, just truth. And Daniel's eyes filled with panic as he whispered, "You can't ask me to do that. Everyone will see it." And I said softly, "That's the point. You made the lie public. Now the truth deserves the same stage." And 3 days later the post went up, the words brief but heavy. "I wrongfully accessed my mother's accounts without permission. I deeply regret my actions and take full responsibility." And the comments changed overnight. The same people who once praised him now recoiling, his silence after that absolute. And when the first repayment hit my account, I didn't smile. I just sat by the window with a cup of tea watching the snow melt along the fence line. Justice not feeling like triumph but like breathing after years underwater. And for the first time in decades I realized I no longer needed Daniel's approval, only my own peace. Spring came slowly that year, as if Wisconsin itself was cautious about trusting warmth again. The last of the snow melting into the soil, the fields turning soft and green, and for the first time in years I felt my chest open with something close to peace. And the final payment from Daniel arrived in April, $22,000, including restitution, damages, and legal fees, and I didn't even check the balance because I already knew what I wanted to do with it. And a month later, I stood on the porch of a small cottage overlooking Lake Mott, the water rippling in the sunlight, the house not big but perfect, 2 bedrooms, wide windows, and a narrow path that led down to the dock. And the realtor handed me the keys, and for a long moment I just stared at them. They felt heavier than I expected, not because of metal but meaning. This was the first home I had ever bought entirely for myself. Not for Daniel, not for survival, not for anyone else's comfort, just me. And the first morning there I brewed coffee and sat by the window as dawn painted the lake gold. My dog, Jasper, a golden retriever I'd adopted from the shelter, resting his head on my knee, and I could still smell the faint scent of fresh paint mixed with lake air, the sound of gentle waves against the shore replacing the silence that used to haunt me back at the farmhouse. And sometimes I still thought about Daniel. I wondered if he slept at night, or if guilt had finally found him. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate takes too much energy, but I no longer wanted him near me either. He called once a few weeks after the last payment cleared. His voice sounded small, almost like a boy again. "Mom," he said, "maybe we can start over someday." I let the silence hang. Then I said, "I wish you peace, Daniel, but peace doesn't live where lies do." He didn't answer. He just breathed quietly before hanging up. That was the last time I heard his voice. Now my days belong entirely to me. I tend to a small garden by the porch, rows of tulips and lavender that sway with the wind. I take morning walks into town, greet the bakery owner by name, and spend afternoons reading novels by the water. In the evenings, I sit on the dock with Jasper, throwing pebbles into the lake, watching the ripples fade into the horizon. It's not loneliness that fills my house now. It's stillness, the kind that comes when you stop living to please people who feed on your guilt. And every night before bed, I whisper a small prayer of gratitude, not for what I gained, but for what I finally let go. I used to believe being a good mother meant giving endlessly, forgiving endlessly. But love without limits becomes a leash, and I had worn that leash for far too long. Now, I know love can still be fierce without surrender. Boundaries are not walls, they're doors we choose to keep closed when peace lives on the other side. For the first time in my 62 years, I wake up to silence and call it freedom. And that, I've learned, is the truest form of love there is. The kind you finally give,